My guest today is a real American hero. He's the writer of the G.I. Joe role-playing game.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I have an incredible interview for you today. Here it is. My guest today is a writer, game designer, and director of logistics for the No Direction Network, Ryan Costello. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. You were on episode 8 a couple years ago. This will be like episode 170-ish in the early 170s. So good to have you back on.
Look how far we've come.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Look how far this little podcast has kept going for this long. So that is awesome. I am really looking forward to your conversation today, because you kind of reached out. You called me on something. I was speculating in a podcast about why there wasn't a G.I. Joe role-playing game, and you reached out because not only is there a G.I. Joe role-playing game, you have done work on that game. And so I was more than thrilled to talk about G.I. Joe role-playing game with you because when I was growing up in the early 80s and the mid-80s, I was obsessed with G.I. Joe. I love seeing all the stuff in your background there. I have boxes downstairs that I have not let my kids touch yet because I'm waiting for them to be old enough so they don't just destroy everything.
Yeah. So you're talking about my background. You see the kind of centerpiece on that top shelf is the Terrordrome, which is almost complete and almost in mint condition. Oh, and nice. My daughter showed an interest in playing with them when she was like 4 or 5 years old. So I was like, all right, you can do that. And the Terrordrome doors are like controlled by these little tab system.
Oh no.
And like as soon as she touches the Terrordrome, you just hear like crack. She broke one of the tabs. And it's just like, I should be a thankful father that my daughter is showing interest in my passion, but you you don't know what you just did, honey.
No kidding. So yes, I've kept those separate from my boys so far. But yeah, I just like, since you've been on the podcast before, we're not going to dive into your background as a role player in that. Obviously, you have a lot of credentials in that area. People can go back and listen to that other episode and hear about that. You gave us a really good geeky explanation of Pathfinder and all kinds of stuff back then. But I really want to dive into G.I. Joe because, like I said, I loved G.I. Joe when I was a kid. And there have been some attempts to kind of revive the franchises, blockbusters and such. But why don't we just start with you? When did you discover G.I. Joe? And obviously, you have a lot of interest in that franchise.
Yeah, well, like you, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 80. And G.I. Joe, as we think of it, like the real American hero, the 4-inch ones rather than the original 12-inch, that came out in 82. Mm-hmm. And so I was playing with G.I. Joe before my earliest memories. So I don't know my earliest memory of G.I. Joe. I don't know what my first G.I. Joe was. Because by the time I was in 5th, 6th grade, I was well into G.I. Joe. I was a big fan. I have a brother that's a couple of years older. So most of my Joes were probably his. But I know that by the time I was in kindergarten, I was a big fan of Flint, who had come out that year. Mm. And I was into him because he was the new guy. And so I already knew stuff before Flint, but really my G.I. Joe memories kind of start with Flint in 85.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm a bit older than you, but my first one that I bought, it was so random because I ended up buying, and I'm going to forget the name of it. It was like the Cobra exoskeleton that went around somebody.
The snake armor.
Yeah. And I had bought that. And I don't know why, because I had barely seen the show. I think I only seen like maybe a little bit or heard about it, because then like right after that, like the show premiered and then I was just into it. And the next one I bought was Zartan, where didn't his what was it? His face changed colors or whatever.
His whole
like,
skin. So
yes,
he kind of is like
yeah.
in this armored sports bra. So he has a lot of exposed skin, and the flesh tone that they used turned blue in the sun.
Yes, that's right. And oh man, I love that. And then I was off from there on, and I just bought like everything. And like I said, I still have downstairs. I still have the offshore drilling platform, like the offshore platform. I still have that. It was the GI Joe headquarters, big thing. I forget what it's called, but
GI Joe HQ.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And so I had that, and oh my gosh, I just remember watching the cartoon as much as possible. And I know Hasbro now plays it 24/7 on YouTube. I'll check in every once in a while and catch a little bit of the episode at like 12 a.m. when I'm done doing some work or whatever. But because it's so awesome. But that is really cool that you were so into GI Joe, and now you get to do some writing on the RPG. Is that
more than just some writing?
Yes,
I wrote about a third of the core rulebook. Nice. So originally, these games that eventually became known as the Essence 20 games, or the Hasbro games that are run on the Essence 20 system. Mm-hmm. The original idea when Renegade announced that they had the licensed Power Rangers, GI Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, which at this point I guess is about 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was said that they were going to run on 5th edition, on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition's engine. Mm-hmm. And I was brought in not like as someone who still has yet to play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, because like you said, the last time I was on, I was talking about how I was all in on Pathfinder. Mm-hmm. And I'm not someone that has time for multiple role-playing game systems. I like getting super into one, playing multiple campaigns in it, seeing what you can do with different kinds of builds and directions for characters. So I used to play Dungeons & Dragons. I transferred over to Pathfinder, and now I'm playing Essence 20. But anyway, so it was going to be a 5th edition product, and I was brought in to do more of the lore sections because I had convinced them that I really know my stuff when it comes to G.I. Joe lore. Mm-hmm. And in the design process, at one point, it was decided that these franchises were better served with an original system. There's still, you could see the similarities to 5th edition, how that was like a jumping off point. Mm-hmm. But it really, Essence 20 really is its own engine now, and it was crafted so that it could really highlight the action adventure stories of these 80s and 90s properties. My Little Pony being an exception that maybe we'll talk about after, because I did work on that as well. Mm-hmm. But so originally I was brought in as a designer, but who was mostly working on lore. And then when it became a new system, we had this team with a lot of experience with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but not a lot of experience with multiple different systems and designing a system from the ground up. Not that I had done any systems on my own, but as the host of a Pathfinder podcast, I had talked to everyone that was involved in both Pathfinder 1st edition and 2nd edition. And so I had accidentally given myself a master class in designing a new role-playing game over the 10 or so years that I was hosting the No Direction podcast. And so I knew a lot of like, well, we need to make sure we're checking these boxes. We need to make sure we're doing the build in a certain way. And I eventually went from just like the lore guy to one of the captains of the ship. Like Essence 20 came to be because of the combined talents of the 10 or so people that worked on the system. But my role in it evolved completely when it went from a 5th edition game to an Essence 20 game.
Okay. And why don't you dive in a little bit and kind of familiarize us with Essence 20, I guess, before we dive into some of the role-playing games, so people understand exactly kind of what that means.
Sure. So Essence 20, like I said, has a lot of similarities to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So if you've played Dungeons & Dragons or even Pathfinder, any edition of either of those games, you'll recognize a lot of elements. We've got a main option called your role, which has a lot of similarities to classes. It's got 20 different levels. Each level you get a certain, we call them new perks, but you get like what other games would call a class feature. And you get some increases to our stats, which are the essences, which are your strength, speed, smarts, and social. So those are your 4 ability scores. And every time you increase an ability score, you get a skill point that you can put into one of the 21 skills. And when you get a skill point, what you're doing is increasing the die you roll when you are rolling a skill test. So if, let's say I make a first level character and I put 2 ranks into, let's say, athletics, one of the skills. Normally, I would roll 1d20 and 1d4 because 2 ranks would mean that I went from a 1d2 to 1d4. And so I'm adding the d20 and the d4 together. And that's all the math of any roll. So it's very quick and it's very math friendly. Or if you are someone that struggles with math, this is a great system for you because it focuses on just you have to do an addition of a d20 and another single die. So then I've got this first level character. Let's say I go up a level, I increase my strength. I could bump my athletics from a d4 to a d6 because now I've got 3 ranks in that skill. And so the only thing I'll ever have to worry about when I'm rolling my dice is rolling a d20 and my skill rank. And what's really fun is that we've got a couple of mechanics that then manipulate the dice you're rolling. So we've got edge and snag, which again, if you're familiar with 5th edition, it's very similar to advantage disadvantage in that you are rolling 2d20 and either taking the better or the worst, depending on whether things are in your favor or not. And so a lot of options in the game will say, under certain circumstances, you get an edge or you negate a snag. But then the other fun manipulation of your probability is the upshift and downshift system, where depending on the circumstances, you can get benefits. You can effectively have more ranks in a skill than you would. So if I've got my character, my athlete with his D6, and let's say I've got some kind of climbing gear, let's say I've built an alpine type character, then that gear might give me an effective up 2, which means that instead of rolling my D6, I go up 1 to D8, then up 2 to D10. So now I'm rolling a D20 and a D10. And so it's a very satisfying system if you like just the feel of dice in your hands. And then on top of that, we've got specializations. When you put a rank in a skill, instead of going up to the next die, you can just say, I am specialized in something related to that skill. So in athletics, I could be specialized in climbing. And what that means is not only are you rolling a D20 and your skill die, but you're rolling the entire ladder of dice that's below your skill die. So if I have that D6 and I'm in a situation where I'm climbing, my athletics won't just be a D20 and a D6. It's a D20, a D6, a D4, and a D2. And I'm taking the best of my skill dice and adding it to my D20.
Wow.
Yeah, so you get a real handful of dice, kind of like that Shadowrun feel of just you are the dice tower.
Yeah.
But in a more concentrated, focused way.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, because I have not played one of these games, so this is it's new to me. So it's really fascinating, though. I kind of like that the way the skills just add on an extra D instead of some kind of modifier or something like that. I like that. So
yeah, so it's something that I have taught to my daughter because I tried to teach my daughter Pathfinder out of the Pathfinder 2nd Edition beginner box. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that I would just tell her what dice she's rolling instead of having her try and figure out her character sheet.
Sure.
But when it comes to, we were playing an Essence 20 game, it was really just so you're rolling the D20. And so we had the color coded dice. So it's you're rolling the D20 and the yellow die, and she would roll them together. She would be able to do the math. And so it's really friendly for newer players or players that just don't want to slow the game down if they feel like they've got to figure out all of their bonuses. Mm-hmm. And it's also it's fun as a designer because it's actually really easy to calculate because you can just figure out the average of any die pretty easily. It's half 0.5. So you just always kind of round down to give the players a little bit of an edge so that the odds are always slightly in their favor, which everybody enjoys. It's easy to write for. It's easy to design for.
No, and that's what I was going to ask kind of next is the target numbers or difficulty numbers, because that is always the game master's one huge job, really. After, thinking of lore or thinking of, setting the stage and stuff like this is we always have to have a target number or a difficulty number. So that's interesting.
Yeah. So the target number generally is 10 to 15 because when you're upshifting, you're only gaining a statistical probability of +1. So 10 to 15 really, it covers the broad scope of it. And it means that 2 characters, one of them is much better at that one skill that's being rolled, then the odds are that much better that they roll it, but without completely abandoning the person who only put 1 rank into a skill. With a D20 and a D2, you've still got a chance of hitting a D10, a difficulty 10, still got a chance of hitting a difficulty 15. You can even hit a difficulty 20, but it's harder. So yeah, so we aim for that 10 to 20 range. The exception is in combat, your abilities, so your essences, also dictate your defenses, which are your toughness, your evasion, your willpower, and your cleverness. And so it's 10 plus your essence score. So we're again talking about my character that's got those ranks in athletics. That means that I've got at least 4 strength, which means that I've got a defense, a toughness of 14. And so it really, if you like a Plinko effect on your character sheet when you just make one change and suddenly you've made several other changes, and it's really like it's a minor change that affects multiple things, and everything just kind of fits together in this logical box, because the higher your strength, the higher your toughness, and then you get more granular in what that means for your character.
Okay. No, that's really, really interesting. And so you said it kind of captures that feel of kind of the 80s, 90s cartoons and stuff. How do you think that captures the feel of that, really?
So it's very action-oriented skills, and the way combat works is the same way as any kind of skill check works. So really, the stakes are always as high, whether you're in a combat or whether you're running past an oil field that's exploding and you've got to use your acrobatics, or you've got to just kind of tough it out to make sure that the fire's not bothering you, whatever your tactic for approaching it. But it's always easy. So it's very easy for a GM to just be like, here's the situation you're in. Now tell me what skills you're using to address your situation, like whether you're drowning in a lake, whether you are racing a race car, whether you're skydiving onto a Cobra trouble bubble, and then you're trying to do a move to pop the pilot out and steal his trouble bubble for him. It's all just captured by a couple of different skill rolls that are like, it's just simple, it's fast, and because the players have a part in the narrative when they're deciding what skill they're using and how they're using it, it's very easy for the GM and the players to collaborate and to create the scene.
No, that's really interesting. And now just before we dive into a little bit, because I want to ask you about maybe creating G.I. Joe heroes and stuff, but let's take a step back. You said you wrote, about a third of the core book and that, which is amazing. Why don't you just give us the thumbnail sketch? How did you get on this project? Because obviously it would seem like a dream project, I think.
Yeah. So it's a combination of spending the last 10, 15 years really immersed in the Pathfinder influencing sphere, and also really being invested in G.I. Joe. So I'm not just a fan of G.I. Joe. I was on a documentary show called Fanatical. That's what it was called. I was on the G.I. Joe episode of that. I helped run the Canadian G.I. Joe convention. I was a moderator on multiple G.I. Joe message boards, and I would write articles just at random. Just sometimes whenever I had a thought on G.I. Joe, I would reach out to somebody that I knew that was running a blog or other website and just be like, hey, can I just talk about G.I. Joe with you? So I've appeared on podcasts when Talk Without Rhythm reviewed the G.I. Joe movies. I was sitting in as a special guest to talk about the G.I. Joe movies. When there was that, when Force Awakens came out, and there were a lot of people saying that there was just it was too hard to get the Rey action figures, and there was a real movement to make sure there were more female action figures on the shelves and that there was more representation. G.I. Joe had just put out a very high representation wave of action figures. So I was like, G.I. Joe is doing this thing that you are wishing that all other toy lines were doing. And so I wrote an article about that for Geek Dad. So there was that. And then again, as someone that has a podcast and a blog and hosts a blogging podcast network, I was deep involved in how the industry works, which is a smaller industry than you might think it is. And so there's a lot of crossover between the different systems that are being designed. And so when I saw that announcement that Renegade was putting out these games, and I saw the G.I. Joe name attached to it, and then within a couple of days of that first press release saying they've got the licenses, a second press release was put out saying that Elisa Teague was going to be in charge of Renegade's new their RPG division. Mm-hmm. And so I said, all right, how many people am I removed from Elisa Teague? How do I get in touch with her? Mm-hmm. So I found someone who had worked on the Pathfinder Adventure card game, who had been on my podcast several times. I got in touch with him. I said, hey, I see that Elisa has worked with you a lot. Can you put in a good word with Elisa for me and get me in touch with her so that I can get her contact info? By that, I was able to send in a resume that said, here's all my here's my G.I. Joe credentials. Here's my role-playing game credentials. You want me on a G.I. Joe role-playing game. There is no one that is better qualified for this specific product that you're creating than me. And I can say that totally honestly and without arrogance. I just happen to be perfectly lined up with what this product is. And Renegade agreed, and they brought me on. And since then, I've had a part in almost every G.I. Joe product that they've either put out or have plans on putting out for the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, that's amazing. And like kind of what I was alluding to before, what does that feel like now just to be able to, since you're merging two of your loves, GI Joe and role-playing games, what does that feel like?
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. So it also helps. I really like the system that was created because most of it was the idea of Brian C.P. Steele, who's on the design team, and then the specialization specifically was added by Paige Lightman. So they came up with a big chunk of the core system, and I just really like it. And I really like how playing with it makes me feel like I'm playing with G.I. Joes. And when I have like a breakthrough of like, here's a specific thing that's mentioned on one character's file card, and I know exactly how to make that into its own perfect rule. Like that is really like a satisfying feeling when the Venn diagram becomes a circle.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then you mentioned the file card. I used to collect them. I would buy the, because for people who don't know, on the back of the action figure pack, they would come with a file card. The figure would come with a file card describing their code name, their real name, their resume, their specialty, their military specialty, and all that. And I would cut those out and I put them in a little box. And
nice.
I found it. I found it a couple years ago when I'm cleaning out stuff, all of my stuff from my childhood. I found the box. I still have those. I hid them downstairs again, like I said, so nobody destroys them until they're old enough to, or I may never let people see those because they're amazing. Or I'll take pictures of them and make a blog post about it or something. But so those file cards, that's really cool. Then you can match those up into a role-playing game. And I mean, even when I was a kid, because I was introduced to D&D when I was 9, right around the time the G.I. Joe was, hitting the airwaves with the cartoon, and I was buying up that stuff. I was always wanting to play in a G.I. Joe role-playing game. Like I just always wanted a G.I. Joe role-playing game. So why don't you talk a little bit? You've already told us about the system a little bit. I'm wondering, you said it has levels. So do you make do you make characters that then progress through the game, or are we Flint and Duke and Lady J and Scarlet like right off the bat or something?
So you have the option to create a character based on the actual roster from like canonical G.I. Joe, but the game is designed as though you're going to make your original character and you're going to play alongside of them. So those characters, many of those characters get mentioned in an introductory chapter where we have something called G.I. Joe data files, which is very similar to the file cards, but a little more truncated. And it's basically a little description of the character's personality and what they do at the Pit, which is the canonical name of the G.I. Joe headquarters, just to give GMs an idea of like, if you want airtight in a scene, airtight's pit duty is the enviro controls maintenance. So you can just have a scene set in like the laboratory. You can have him messing around with the environment controls of the pit itself. And that's your starting off point. Or you can have the team needs to go to the environmental controls area to get something. And when they get there, there's airtight and you can have a scene involving airtight. Wow. So that's how the canonical characters fit into it. But the assumption is that all of the characters that the players are playing are original characters. Okay. Now, the opportunity is there for them to base their characters on these existing characters. So all of the different options for when you are building your character, most of them draw inspiration from either a specific Joe or like an archetype of a Joe type character. And when you are building your character, you've got 3 main options that you're choosing, that you're building towards at character creation. You've got your role, which you already talked about, and that is what you are doing on the G.I. Joe team. You've got your origin, which is how you got into G.I. Joe to begin with. And I guess I should say that all the games that I mentioned, so Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, not only do they all use Essence 20, they are cross-compatible, but how we define certain options changes. So origin is something that is the most specific to each different game, even though it provides the same suite of options. So for Transformers, your origin is your chassis and it is your alt mode. In G.I. Joe, for the most part, it's your military training before you join G.I. Joe. Or if you were a civilian, what you did to stand out as a civilian to qualify for this team of international, peacekeepers. And then finally, you've got an option called influences, which is very much moments in time or parts of your personality that set you on the path to being the adventurer, being the hero that you are. And you could take 1 to 3 influences. If you only take one, you're fine. If you take more than one, each influence comes with a hang-up. And so each influence gives you a perk. And if you take multiple ones, it comes with a hang-up, which is like a negative perk. So if you are an adventurer, then you can get, you get an edge when you could tie the situation at hand into one of the adventures that you've been going on. You get an edge on a smarts or social-based skill test. But the hang-up is that you have wanderlust, and so you suffer a snag on social and smarts-based skill tests if you've been in the same place for more than a few days. Oh. So if you are playing an adventurer if you're playing a character and adventure is your first influence, you don't get that hang-up. You just get the perk. But the idea is that you could stack these influences on if you want a multi-dimensional character, but every one that you stack on to make up for the fact that you're getting bonus benefits, you also are getting these extra drawbacks, which in some cases are more interesting than the benefits that you're getting and really play into how you're role-playing your character.
Yeah, absolutely. I love systems that do that allow you to take like some kind of advantage or disadvantage or whatever the terminology is, some kind of perk and then a drawback or something like that. I love the ones that do that because you can really craft a character, like you said, give different dimensions to the character because, you say, okay, well, these things, these perks are going to help me do these roles because we're going to be fighting, we're going to be doing these things. But those drawbacks all the time, they just create, just role-playing opportunities and just all kinds of just interesting story ideas and hooks and stuff around them. So I love systems that do that. I'm
just going to add that I actually am not usually a fan of systems that do that. I like when an option is additive. I don't like when it's additive and subtractive. So I like that if you just want one influence, you don't get the hang up. Sure. And that way, if you are just like negative averse for options for your character, then you can completely avoid it. It's in your hands how complicated you want this character to be.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. But I always found that the drawbacks do just supply, some kind of, just an extra ability to role play or just different things. I remember some years back, I played a Legend of the Five Ring character and I made him blind because I was thinking Zatoichi, right? The blind swordsman. And that really defined his character. So that was a big drawback, but I got I can't remember exactly, but it was like 2 or 3 advantages because I took that, being blind as a disadvantage. And I just thought it was, I just enjoy, kind of, systems like that. So that's really cool. And now, I know we're talking about G.I. Joe, but there's also Transformers and even Power Rangers and My Little Pony kind of all wrapped in there. And that's interesting too, because I hadn't realized that all of those games were using the same system. And I should have, because I think I had seen that it was Renegade Games or something like that was, putting them out. But so, just to dig into a little bit more of G.I. Joe before maybe we touch on Transformers or some of the other ones. I'm just thinking, when you create your character, you were saying you were coming up with stuff. I'm just remembering from those file cards, like Flint, says like he's a Rhodes Scholar and, different things like that on those cards. And I'm just wondering, do you add things like that to your character? Is that what you mean when you were talking about like what they were before they joined the G.I. Joe?
So that's probably falls more under influence than origin.
Okay.
We don't specifically have Rhodes Scholar. What would be the... we have Specialist, we have Professional. Either of those could fall into Rhodes Scholar. We've got one Checkered Past, and this one was written with Mercer and Lowlight in mind. So Mercer is the ex-Cobra Viper who's seen the light, and Lowlight is the sniper who specializes in night missions, but he had this amazing episode of the animated series where his dad thought he was just kind of too wimpy, and so he abandoned him in a garbage dump, basically, and told him not to come home until he had killed 10 rats. And this is from the file card, and then they made a whole episode based around that. Uh-huh. And it's about how everyone's having these nightmares. Like Cobra has created a nightmare inducer, and they're pointing it at G.I. Joe headquarters. Mm-hmm. So everyone's having these nightmares. And meanwhile, Lowlight is waking up totally refreshed, happy like that he's ever been, because he's usually such a sour dude, because he's working through his trauma through these nightmares that Cobra's given him. And then he teaches the other Joes how to just like get over your greatest fears. Anyway, it's a really cool episode, and it really made me appreciate Lowlight as a character.
Yeah.
And that inspired the idea of checkered past, that, yeah, maybe before you got into G.I. Joe, either you did something wrong or something wrong was done to you that has really like followed you through your life. But, you know, now you're either getting over it or whatever didn't kill you makes you stronger, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's the kind of category, those little snippets of like just character details that the file cards would include, those usually turned into influences. Origins, it's much broader and more what you would expect. You could be in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and then there's a couple of other things, like you could be a first responder, you could be from covert ops or intelligence, you could be just straight up a civilian was one of the ones that we added, and this is one of our more versatile origins. You could be an engineer or you can be a scientist.
Okay. No,
and of course, like, you don't have to be one of these to, like, what's his name? Mainframe. Mainframe is the computer specialist, but if you read his file card, he joined the Army, he left the Army, he just took up computers because that was kind of the hip new career to get into in the 80s. Or I guess it would have been the late 70s when canonically he did it originally. And then
Yes.
after a full career in computers, he joins the Marines. And so if you were building a character like Mainframe, you could either go straight to, well, he's an engineer because of this tech background he has, or if you want to emphasize that, no, he's the tech specialist, but he's got a military background, and you then have a little bit smarts, a little bit strength to your character. You could throw him in the Army, or we are talking about adding a Marine specific origin, but what product that might show up in has not been announced yet.
All right. Well, a little tease to the audience there as well. That's nice.
I have to say, so these books were originally supposed to come out like 6 months to a year before they did. In fact, so Transformers is out today, but all three of these core rule books were originally intended to come out at Gen Con last year. But, you know, with like shipping and supplies delays, exactly, everything got put off. 2021, like last
2021.
year.
Oh,
yeah, this was Transformers was delayed by over a year because of it. And so they just kept having us write according to the original schedule. So I have something like 7 books that are turned over to them, only 2 of which have been announced. Maybe only one. No, 2 of which have been announced.
Wow.
And so there's all these books that I'm like, Essence 20 has evolved as a system. I've gotten so much better as an Essence 20 designer because of all this experience. And then like when I'm going through the core rulebook, it's just like, oh, we've come so far since this. And yet this is basically the only book that people have as far as character creation for this game. So, yeah, like I'm really looking forward to, you know, whenever the releases finally catch up to all the work that I've put in. Although by then I'll probably have another 5 books that have not been announced and are just sitting on a computer somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. That you guys are, you know, you're putting out so much material and stuff.
Yeah, Renegade is super dedicated to this. And I also assume that because these are most likely expensive licenses, they're motivated to make sure that they get as much out of those licenses as they can. I'm not privy to exactly how these licenses came to be, but I have to speculate that, you know, they're paying for these licenses. They made these cross-compatible games, so the more books they put out while they have the license to release them, just the better the system will be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can only imagine. Well, I can't even imagine how much it would cost to get the licenses. So I am sure that they would want to get out some product and take it, you know, full advantage of these licenses and get out some really awesome you know, role playing games and stuff with them. And so now this is more of a funny one, but since G.I. Joe and Transformers, I mean, they're in the same world. We're talking about the same universe, right? Yep. If they're compatible, nice.
So each rulebook is written as though this is its own world. But we have, so like Renegade has a Discord server and there's a whole channel dedicated to if you want to do crossover of the Essence 20 games. And so the advice that I give in that channel is like, they could just flat out be like one day Snake Eyes could be walking down the street and bump into Bumblebee. They just coexisted, but because both of them kind of have their own covert war going on, they just didn't realize they both existed in the same universe. Or you can do that these are multi-dimensional things and something, probably a Decepticon scheme, but could be a Cobra scheme, or it could just be coincidentally Cobra and the Decepticons had a scheme that happened to bridge the worlds together. There's definitely ways of, if you want to just merge the worlds for a little bit and then separate them, like if you're running 2 separate campaigns, you just want to do a crossover event with your group, that's possible. It really is there is no one strict rule of how these two how any of the four systems or the four settings that we have running on the same system could cross over.
Yeah. And of course, I was being a little, just like a little fanboy because I think seeing Duke riding on top of Optimus Prime would just like blow my mind.
Well, here, let me show you.
Oh, no.
You've got some stuff can't see it, but
yeah. Listeners can't see it. I'll describe it. So Ryan is reaching into a huge stack of action figures and he pulls out G.I. Joe and the Transformers.
Yeah, so this is Old Snake and the Stealth Battle Android Troopers. So there was an episode of Transformers, the original 80s animated series called Only Human, and some human enemies of the Transformers got in touch with this guy, Old Snake, who looks exactly like Cobra Commander in a fedora and a trench coat. Mm-hmm. Is voiced by Chris Latta, and like is very obviously supposed to be Cobra Commander, but is never actually addressed as Cobra Commander in the episode. They talked to him about using his synthoid technology. Synthoids being like this purple goo-based clones that Cobra had come up with on the G.I. Joe animated series. Mm-hmm. So like this is a crossover episode. Mm-hmm. And they, so he transfers the consciousness of 4 of the Autobots into these synthoids, giving them human form. So it's Ultra Magnus, Rodimus Prime, Springer, and RC are all transferred into human bodies for the duration of the episode. And at the end, when they, Autobots defeat the people that paid Old Snake to do this evil scheme and they get their own bodies back, you just have Old Snake kind of walking into the sunset. And then he's like, well, he is talking to himself. And then he just starts screaming like, Cobra! And then his voice cracks right before he gets to it. So at that point, Sunbow, the animated company that produced the cartoons, they lost the license to G.I. Joe. This was after the animated movies came out. And Transformers bombed, My Little Pony bombed, and so G.I. Joe they couldn't even afford to send to theaters. That became a direct-to VHS release. And so they lost the license to it, and yet someone was just so bold, they were like, we're going to have Cobra Commander in an episode. We're going to call him Old Snake, but everyone is going to be sure this is Cobra Commander. So this is a toy based on his appearance as Old Snake, and they took a couple of... just some kind of Decepticon that turns into a drone or a bomber, and they painted them up like the Battle Android Trooper color scheme.
Nice.
They weren't involved in that episode, but just to commemorate... Sorry, I shouldn't be facing away from the mic. They weren't involved in that episode, but just to commemorate the idea of a Transformers G.I. Joe crossover. Nice. So that's based on one of the earliest crossovers, but even... hitting store shelves now, they've got a Megatron that turns into a Hiss tank, and it's not just it looks like a Hiss tank. It's flat out says on the package, this is Megatron. He's teaming up with the Baroness. She comes with the Megatron toy, and he turns into a Hiss tank that is perfectly in scale with the vintage Hiss tank. But it's got a different gun on its turret, and it unfolds and it becomes Megatron.
Wow.
Yeah. So
oh man.
It feels like we should have had way more crossovers of G.I. Joe and Transformers over the years, but Hasbro, for whatever reason, has been shy. I think they wanted to make a Hasbro Cinematic Universe a couple of years ago based on, the popularity of Marvel. But in the announcement, they specifically listed just about all of their properties except Transformers. So it was like Transformers movies are doing well, so we're not going to mess with that. And then we've got this other Cinematic Universe that's going to be G.I. Joe, Mask. I see how they mix together. Yeah. I think it was Visionaries, which is like a fantasy game. I don't know if you remember the Visionaries action figure. They had the holograms on their chests, and otherwise they were like these 6-inch knights. They had similar articulation to G.I. Joe. Cops might have been on there, which is supposed to take place in the future. So, and Micronauts. And so it's like, how are you going to blend all of those when you could start with G.I. Joe meets Transformers? Like isn't that the one that sells itself? And then you make the cinematic universe based on that? Like the Transformers movies already have them teaming up with military in every single movie. Why not just make the slow pivot and make some of those characters G.I. Joes?
Yeah, no kidding. Because, now that you just mentioned that, the Baroness riding on top of Megatron is like, mind blown right there, because that's amazing. It would seem that would be almost a normal progression, like some military guys come and get Optimus Prime and one of them turns around and says, they call me Duke or whatever. I mean, it should blow people's minds, but I don't know.
Well, some people, when Bumblebee was coming out and they announced that John Cena was hired into it, I know a bunch of G.I. Joe fans that were like, what if John Cena is Joe Colton, the guy who founds G.I. Joe, and he's the original G.I. Joe, and like that's the jumping off point. That's why it's set in the 80s. This was all just like hopeless optimism that there would be some kind of crossover. Yeah. So no, instead John Cena was just another military guy in these movies.
Yeah.
Produced by the people that have the premier military franchise out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, now, you were saying, so you've also worked on Transformers role-playing game, and it's also an Essence 20 game. Before time gets totally away from me, and because I could talk about G.I. Joe all day. Before,
what's that like?
I don't know. I don't know. And especially I know since I have you on the line, I could ask you a ton of questions because I've forgotten so much and from back in the day. But before I derail another podcast and just start reliving my childhood, I will talk about, I do want to ask you about the Transformers role-playing game. So do you make Transformers? I'm guessing you do. Can you make human characters as well?
So yes, you make Transformers. So far, you don't make human characters. Again, this book is just coming out now. Okay. Although I'm aware of a couple more books that are coming out. So I did work on the Transformers core rulebook. Mm-hmm. But I was brought in kind of later into the process because originally we had I'll name everyone that was working on the original Essence 20 team. So it's myself, Ben Heisler, who was on the G.I. Joe team with me. Gabriel Hicks was on Transformers. Paige Lightman was on G.I. Joe. J.F. Sambrano, was on Transformers. Brian C.P. Steele was on Power Rangers. T.J. Storm was on Power Rangers. Elisa Teague was on all of them. And Eddie Webb was on Transformers. I feel like maybe I accidentally put somebody from Power Rangers on Transformers, but no, anyway, that sounds about right. Mm-hmm. So the Transformers team had turned over their manuscript, and then because of all the production delays, we could only do one book at a time. And so Power Rangers came out, and then G.I. Joe came out, and by the time Transformers was about ready to go to print, we were getting feedback on Power Rangers and G.I. Joe, which were two books that were done very differently. And some of the feedback was really saying like people were preferring how G.I. Joe explained the rules and things. And so I was brought on to the Transformers book to just be like, go over what the Transformers team put out and see if you could make it more in line with this is the feedback that we're getting. Make sure that it's more in line with what people like and avoids the things they don't like. And so I did a lot of work on the origins and roles to make sure that they were robust and clear and that it wasn't just like a concept based on a single character, but it was like a template that you could use to create multiple characters for any given role. And then I just kind of brushed up on everything else in the book. So my main participation in the Transformers role-playing game core rulebook was just realigning the origins and the roles to make sure that they were more in line with how G.I. Joe presented them.
Okay. No, that's interesting. And that reminded me of another thing I did want to ask about the roles within G.I. Joe. Of course, we can kind of talk about Transformers as well, but because one of the cool things about G.I. Joe was that like most everybody was different, right? Everybody had their specialty. Somebody had a bow and arrow. Somebody had a flamethrower. Somebody had a whatever. Somebody was a hacker. Like you mentioned, somebody was a sniper, all of those different things. So, and you reflected that in the roles. That seems like a big job.
Yeah. Well, so what we decided to do was we have 7 roles. So Power Rangers, I believe, has 8 roles. And one of the ideas was that we would have 8 roles per book. But one of the changes that the G.I. Joe team made was that instead of having 8 roles and try and cover everything, including a lot of roles that would probably overlap, we decided to make 7 roles, but each role has a focus. And so within any given role, you then make a second choice to show what kind of that role you are. So the roles are commando. And when you choose to be a commando, you can choose to either be an infiltrator, so someone that really specializes in sneaking around. And that's usually, if you want to build Snake Eyes, you're building the commando infiltrator. Sniper, so Low Light would also be a commando, but he would be a very different type of commando than Snake Eyes. And then Spy, so that's like Scarlet. So right there, that's 3 fairly well recognized, like 2 A-listers and a B or C-lister that people should recognize. And you could see how they're all commandos, but you also see how they need specific rules to change how you would build them as commandos.
Mm-hmm.
So, and from there, we've got infantry. Infantry, you could be either an artillerist, and so you could be like bazooka or gung-ho and have an explosive weapon. You could be mechanized infantry, which is somebody that specializes in vehicles. So our examples are Clutch or Wild Bill. Just mechanized infantry kind of implies it's just ground troopers, but we really said like any vehicle specialist would fall into that focus option. Mm-hmm. And then we've also got the medic. So if you want to be Doc or Stretcher or Lifeline or some of the more obscure characters, you can do that. Mm-hmm. Next up, we've got the officer. The officer focuses are like their battlefield, their command style. So we've got the battlefield psychologist, and that's all about just like messing with the heads of your enemies and like bolstering the confidence of your allies. Mm-hmm. There is the frontline leader. So that's how General Hawk and Duke are described. And that is that by fighting well, you inspire the people around you to fight better. And then the Grandmaster. So this was one of the options that was taken from one very specific reference on a file card. Admiral Keelhaul is the character that came with the USS Flag, the giant aircraft carrier. Mm-hmm. And his file card describes how he moves all of the ships in the fleet around like chess pieces on a board. And so Grandmaster is for the officer that has a very technical mindset. And all of the perks that you get from it are named after chess terms.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah.
We're about halfway through. You good if I just kind of go through the entire list of roles and options? All right.
Go ahead.
So next up, we've got Rangers. Rangers have Beastmaster. So if you want to specialize in having a pet, there's the Predator, which I like the wordplay of how I described it here is that Predators are human hunters. And that can be taken in two ways. You could be a human who hunts, or you could be the hunter of humans.
Nice.
Yeah, and then finally you've got the Scout. So that's if you want to you check the lay of the land, you make sure that it is safe to progress.
Like Spirit.
Next up, so this was the role that I kind of had to fight to get included because the G.I. Joe book went over words by quite a lot, and we were talking about content to cut. And so one of the roles is called the Renegade. And it is based on, if you've seen the G.I. Joe animated movie, at one point they send Falcon to special training with Sergeant Slaughter, and he meets up with the Renegades, which are kind of like the G.I. Joe equivalent of the Dreadnoks. These are people who, the way I describe it in the book is that if G.I. Joe didn't take them, Cobra would have. And so instead of having these guys that would clearly be fighting against them, they reversed it and they gave them special training to try to work on their lack of discipline. But this is our melee combat role. And so we've got the Blitzer, who is the one that specializes in like getting around the battlefield. Door Kicker is the one that specializes in breaking down obstacles. And the Tank is the Renegade that specializes in absorbing damage. And then we've got the Technician, which is one of the roles that I designed and is one of my favorite roles in the game because it is the tech expert and it is one of the more complicated. It is basically the closest thing we have to a spellcaster in G.I. Joe. If you're interested in a more robust class, then you look at the Technician. The Technician, you could either be the expert, which is basically you call out one specific skill, and you could do a whole bunch of things that usually would rely on other skills, but because you're a tech expert, you use that one skill. And so Lifeline is the example. So if you remember Lifeline, his toy came with this like, it looked like a radio backpack. Like it was really technological for the guy that was supposed to be a medic, as opposed to Doc, who had come out before him. And Doc comes with a stretcher and like a stethoscope, I think. Yeah. So like Lifeline between the two was much more technologically based healer. And so the idea is that if you are Lifeline, then you can use science to do from like much further away, and you can do it. You can influence other people just by being so good at being a medic. Mm-hmm. Then we've got, this is another play on words that I enjoy, the Think Tank. And this is a tank, but this is kind of like the Iron Man type character. You have the heaviest armor or you have integrated weapons. And so if you're a weapon specialist, but not like Bazooka, if you're a weapon specialist, like, I don't know if you remember Fast Draw, but he's the guy that had the missile launching backpack.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you are Fast Draw, then you are a Technician Think Tank. And then finally, there's the Tinkerer. And so the Tinkerer is the one that messes around with equipment and upgrades and whatnot. And so they can affect their own equipment. They can buff up the equipment of the other people in their group. And this is also a role that has probably the most complicated perk of all of them. It is called primary tech. And so you talk about what area, let me see. How do I describe it? Technology not only makes your job as a technician possible, it makes the possibilities of your job as a technician limitless. So you can choose to either be primarily an armor technician, a drone technician, a gear technician, or a weapon technician. And then from there, you go into your focus option that can make it that much more effective. So the combo that we were just talking about, Lifeline, would be a gear technician with a medicine expertise. And so he can heal people from like all across the battlefield, whereas most of the time you have to be adjacent to the person.
Oh, okay. Oh.
And then the final role is one of the more abstract ones. It is the Vanguard. And it is for the characters that are often presented as leaders, but they're not officers. And so some of our examples are Lady J and Roadblock. These are characters that you'll usually see leading the missions, but like Lady J is not an officer. She is usually more of an intelligence officer an intelligence operative or weapon specialist. Anyway, Vanguard is like a crossover of a lot. So if you have a character concept that is just a lot of different things at once, you probably want to look at the Vanguard. And its focus options are bodyguard, so you are there to make sure that somebody else is safe. There is heavy ordnance, which is weapon specialist, and that's where Roadblock falls. And then there is Juggernaut, which I believe is one of our melee specialist roles. And so the Vanguard perks are a lot about being leaders or being like a real stalwarts of the battlefield. And then their focus options show just how they are filling that role more specifically.
Wow, that's awesome. That is really cool how you broke it down, because that was so important to G.I. Joe, like their different roles and their their mission specific skills, I guess, that was so important to that. And of course, all the code names and everything that went kind of right along with that. That was really cool. So that was, thank you for breaking that down for us. That was really neat to see how that does break down. Now we are running out of time here, but but I do want to just follow up with a couple things we haven't even touched on, say like Power Rangers or My Little Pony. Have you worked on those as well?
So Power Rangers, I have barely worked on. The only thing that's been announced that I worked on was the threat creation guide. So that's something that when the book came out, people felt that we didn't have enough villains in the book. And we didn't have any rules for creating villains. And they felt like we should have done one or the other. Either loaded up the core rulebook with a bunch of monsters so that they could play, missions of any level, or let people know how they could create their own monsters. And so we only got that feedback after the book came out. So the solution was that we would create a threat creation guide. And it's for a free PDF. It's like a chunk of words, and it's quite a lot of design work that I did on it. But the workaround is that we earmarked it for a future book that has not been released or has not been announced yet. But basically, this was not just a free PDF. This is a free chunk of a book that eventually will be available for sale. So that's how they justified the expense of paying for, a complicated chunk of design work that went into that. And so I created that. Technically, it's a Power Rangers product because any of the examples geared towards Power Rangers, but it works universally across any of the games that you want to create for, except that it doesn't answer a whole lot of questions regarding alt modes for your Transformers. So if you are creating threats for Transformers, you might make a more basic version than you want, and you'll have to wait until a book comes out that has rules for creating Transformers threats specifically. So I've worked on that, and anyway, everything else that I've worked on for Power Rangers, which again, tertiary at best, it has not been announced yet. And I'm totally fine not working on Power Rangers because I do not know Power Rangers, and I do not want to do an injustice to a fan who picks up a book expecting it to be like, with the same amount of love and care that I put into G.I. Joe or Transformers, and then just be disappointed that all of my examples are just the most basic and that I'm making even some mistakes because I do not know that brand at all.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, I didn't even have many questions because I think I was already working and in college when Power Rangers kind of went into their craze phase or whatever. So I wouldn't have much to add there either. But that's interesting. And then you've done work on My Little Pony though as well, or no?
That's right. So this was kind of the surprise when when the Renegade team said, like, okay, so we're going to finish these 3 core rule books, and then everyone that worked on them has an opportunity to work on future Essence 20 books. What would you be interested in? And my first question was, like, I saw you have the My Little Pony role-playing game license. What's the plan there? And they were like, that's your follow-up? You want to do My Little Pony? You don't want to do more G.I. Joe? Like, we've got all these ideas for other G.I. Joe books. And it's like, I do want to get to more G.I. Joe very soon. But I feel like I might be uniquely qualified to work on My Little Pony because I know it's specifically the Friendship is Magic brand, which I do know very well. And at that point, the number of Essence 20 specialists was just the 10 or so people that had worked on the system. Like, the games were not even out when we started working on the My Little Pony rulebook. So it's not like we could just bring people in. Someone would have to teach them the Essence 20 system. So I said, I'll just work on the mechanics of the My Little Pony rulebook. And then when you're ready to assemble the rest of the team, they could read that and then build out the rest of it based on that plan. So G.I. Joe was a super collaborative process. It was me, Ben, and Paige, with Elisa, as our kind of our master. But My Little Pony was a lot more insular. It was just me coming up with the ideas that I thought were most appropriate for how to translate Essence 20 into a My Little Pony experience, how to translate the My Little Pony storytelling style into this Essence 20 game, which is an action and adventure game. And My Little Pony is, not known for being an action and adventure brand. But in a way it is. Like, every season starts with a 2-parter that usually resolves with a big fight scene. Every season ends with a big fight scene. And every 3rd or 4th episode is some kind of magic-based combat. It's just that the episodes in between don't necessarily have combat. And so it was about making sure that it wasn't too much combat focused, but not completely abandoning the idea that, in this show, they are fighting monsters. They do have these magical fighting powers. So, like, how do we balance that with this same system that was not designed for My Little Pony? It was designed for Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and Transformers, but we also were going to use it for My Little Pony.
Interesting. So no technical expertise sub role or whatever for My Little Pony, I guess not.
No. So we've already announced how the three elements that Elisa describes them as a fashion template, the idea of the influence, the origin, and your roles. Mm-hmm. And so in My Little Pony, your influence will be tied into your cutie mark, which is a major part of My Little Pony characters. Like, the picture on their butts is a very important part of the lore. It ties into their character, it ties into their abilities. And so influence will be more important in My Little Pony than it is in the other games. The other games, it's really the most flavorful option, but minor mechanically. And then your origin will be your species. And so in the core rulebook, originally the plan was just your pony type. So either what they call an earth pony, which is just the regular pony, and then there's the Pegasus and the unicorn. But I believe that's actually going to expand by the time the book comes out. And then the roles are tied into the elements of harmony, which this is something that played out across the entire series, but it was established in the first episode that the 6 main characters each represent a different element of harmony. And when they come together, they create like an extra powerful magic that can take out most of their, solve most of their friendship-based problems.
Nice.
Yeah. So each character will choose a role based on an element of harmony. And this is in the future, I can see us introducing 6 more roles that are not related to elements of harmony to represent the non-main characters and just have like, these are the guards, these are the professionals, like the bakers and whatnot. And have that for people that want a less combat focused or to just don't want combat to be an option in their campaign. It's not something that's been announced. I don't even know what the future plans are for My Little Pony source books, but it's something that I could see us doing in the future.
Nice. Well, I mean, so much stuff here, right? G.I. Joe, Transformers, Power Rangers, My Little Pony. And again, I could just ask you some like esoteric questions about G.I. Joe, but I do want to respect your time and we're running long here. Well, where can people find you? Where can people find these games? And where should they go if they want to check out G.I. Joe or Transformers or learn more about you?
All right, so if you want them to find the games, you go to renegadestudios.com or you go to your friendly local gaming store and you ask them for the G.I. Joe role-playing game, Transformers role-playing game, Power Rangers. All 3 of those are available now. Some of them have further products that are out, like the first 2 have GM screens. All 3 of them have dice sets and I believe dice bags. And all of them have at least one adventure book that's been announced, except I don't think Transformers has had one announced yet. And then also like a follow-up book has been announced, although not all of them have release dates. One of the books that I can say that is up and been announced is an adventure book for G.I. Joe called Operation Cold Iron. And so that is currently up for pre-order on the Renegade website. It's been sent to the printers, so it's supposed to come out this year. But all release dates have been really up in the air. So, don't quote me on it because nobody really knows for sure when these books are coming out until they are in a warehouse and Renegade can start shipping them out. But anyway, that one's up for pre-order if you want to check out another adventure that I wrote. Because I also wrote the adventure that's in the core rule book.
Oh, nice.
As far as where you can find out more about G.I. Joe and Transformers, like you said, Hasbro has multiple dedicated YouTube channels that are both playing Transformers and G.I. Joe like the vintage cartoons around the clock, but also for the G.I. Joe channel specifically, they are, oops, sorry, I accidentally just clicked on a YouTube video. They are also playing some of the later ones. So one of their channels is dedicated to Sigma 6, which is a little bit more anime influenced. G.I. Joe, here, I can show you one of the toys.
Yeah. All right, so Ryan is reaching for one of his action figures again.
So it was larger style of G.I. Joe. It's much more anime focused. It's got all of these cool like play features where you could plug in different accessories. So like this fire baton can connect to the other fire baton if you want to have it more like a
Darth Maul.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or you can clip it to his gun like I had earlier. So that's a series that season 1 was not very good, but season 2 actually got pretty good. And for a long time, the second half of season 2 was hard to find. But now I can watch it anytime I want on YouTube. And they also released G.I. Joe Renegades, which when My Little Pony Friendship is Magic came out, that was one of 3 new series that Hasbro had put out with a lot of advertisement behind. So they also had put out Transformers Prime, which is the one that they were advertising The Rock would be playing Cliff Jumper. Ends up The Rock has like 2 lines as Cliff Jumper, and then they kill him off in the first scene of the first episode. And The Rock was The Rock at this point. It wasn't like, this is the Mummy Returns era The Rock. No, this was after, I don't know, what was his breakout role? Anyway, this was The Rock was already established, and they really wanted you to know that The Rock was in this before they killed him off.
Well, yeah,
and then
it costs too much to keep him.
Yeah, absolutely. But they didn't say that in the ads. They said you could watch a show where The Rock is a Transformer, maybe for the whole series.
Yeah.
And then G.I. Joe Renegades was the new G.I. Joe, where it's very much influenced by the A-Team. A little too much for its own good, I think, because people kind of dismissed it as G.I. Joe the A-Team, where G.I. Joe is just a band of the 4, I think it's 6 main characters. It's Duke, Scarlet, Roadblock, Tunnel Rat, and Snake Eyes. Is that it? I feel like I'm missing somebody. But anyway, so they're on the run because Cobra is basically Amazon, but also Cobra. And so, Cobra, Scarlet has figured out that Cobra is up to no good, and she is trying to expose them. And then the Joes are sent in to stop her because she's like an intelligence officer that's gone rogue. Oh. And then Cobra catches them all together and just announces to the world, it's like, hey, these are public enemy number 1. We say so because we're Cobra, and we have that much influence and reach. And so they all have to go on the run, even though, they don't trust Scarlet. And there's a lot of interesting inter-character dynamics and an amazing voice cast. Like, it really is a great, smart show that unfortunately came off like it was just a dumb ripoff of a pretty simple 80s cartoon. 80s TV show. So anyway, all of Renegades is also available on YouTube. And if you want to watch almost any G.I. Joe, you can find an official Hasbro channel that is playing it.
Yeah.
And then finally, if you want to find out more about me, you could go to nodirectionpodcast.com. That's where you will find I Have an Essence 20 podcast that I'm putting out every couple of weeks with Jason Keeley, formerly of Paizo, but now a developer at Renegade. It's called Upshift, and every 2 weeks we talk about just a topic related to either G.I. Joe or the Essence 20 role-playing games. And you can follow me on Twitter at KD Ryan Costello, or Facebook, I don't know, something about Ryan Costello. kd.ryan.costello.
Nice. All right. Well, I will be sure and put some links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can head over there, check out the show notes, and you'll find at least a few of those links. I will try to get into some of the links to the role-playing games and some links so you can check out Ryan, maybe in his other podcast and things like that. So if you're listening, you can just head over there right now. Well, Ryan, I could ask you a ton more questions about G.I. Joe. But I will refrain since we're going over here. I'll respect your time. All that means is I'll just have to have you back on the show and we'll just talk about G.I. Joe or something at some future date or something like that. But anyway, thank you so much for coming back on the show again. It was awesome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ryan today. It was so much fun talking about G.I. Joe, the role-playing game. Just brought back a ton of my memories from when I was a kid playing with the action figures and watching the cartoon as much as possible when I was a kid. It was just so cool, and Ryan's expertise on the subject and him describing the role-playing game just makes me want to buy it like this instant. In the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, I have placed links to the G.I. Joe role-playing game and some other things that Ryan has worked on. You definitely want to go over there and check those out because knowing is half the battle. All right, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get some free stuff. That's why it's called dicegeeks.com/free. If you would like to support the show in some way, I would greatly appreciate it. You can support the show financially at patreon.com/dicegeeks, or you can just like, rate, review, or subscribe to the show wherever you listen to it. That would be amazing. Those things help the show out immensely. All right, now, guys, I thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming!